لولا أن هدانا الله ثم الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين الشفيع ذنوبنا وحبيب قلوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا بالقاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد والصلاة والسلام على آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين إلى يوم الدين بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ربي شرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. We thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for allowing us to witness yet another Friday and to be together to share a few thoughts. What we want to talk about today is freedom in servanthood. Is there such a thing such as freedom while yet being in servanthood or ubudiyya? These two seemingly contrasting terms. And I want to begin with asking a question, of course to myself and to you as well. Am I free? Are you free? And how does this relate to servanthood or ubudiyya, which seems contrary to freedom? And we are going to look at freedom in the conventional understanding, not with the theological implications that it may have. From the viewpoint of Islam, the human being is a locomotive being. What does that mean? It means that he is journeying, he's traveling, he's moving from his point of origin towards a particular destination. And that particular destination is perfecting himself and towards bliss. And the span and extent of this life is just like a route. We have to traverse this life and on this route in order to reach a particular destination. However, along life and along the route, there are many obstacles that we have to overcome. And in order to overcome these obstacles, and you can relate this to your own life in your own particular ways and in your own particular details. There is no person who has a life free from obstacles. There is no person who is not journeying towards a particular goal. Overcoming obstacles means also that we have to be relatively free or possess freedom while undertaking the journey in order to reach more successfully towards our destination. I think we will agree to these points. The Prophet said, "What is the world to me? What am I to the world? Verily, the example of this world and myself is that of a rider who seeks shade under a tree. Then he moves on and leaves it behind." The rider is on a particular journey. He has set off on a course. He is going towards a destination, and he is facing obstacles along the way. So freedom, what is it? We will all have some kind of emotive feeling when we hear the word freedom. And we want to look at freedom briefly in relation to servanthood and bondage. Numerous and various definitions of freedom have been given, and we don't have scope to go into it. However, in brief, it can be said freedom is in contrast to captivity, bondage, and entanglement. At all times and all societies have had at least this concept of freedom, more or less, that it is something that is in contrast to captivity, bondage, and entanglement. In principle, we comprehend that with the help of opposites, we can understand the opposite. For example, when we want to describe light, we can use the concept of darkness. Of course, in Arabic we have this famous expression that things are known by means of their respective opposites. And one of the main aspects of freedom is spiritual freedom. It's actually one of the core ingredients of Islam. What is it? It refers to a state where a person is socially and spiritually free, allowing him to prosper both materially and spiritually. For such a person, there remains salvation in this world and in the hereafter. On the other hand, if people do not have real freedom, then their inner potential may not be realized to the fullest extent. And people will be as long as such people keep their spiritual facet chained, they will regress and be hindered from progress. We need to be free in every sense of the word, freedom from within, from destructive powers, from man-made forces as well. One of the tasks entrusted to the prophets from the very beginning was to liberate people from their internal locks. And if we introspect, we will know where we are chained. And there is this verse, Surah number 7, 157, وَيَضَعُوا عَنْهُمْ إِصْرَهُمْ وَأَغْلَالَ الَّتِي كَانَتْ عَلَيْهِمْ. This part of the verse, and speaking about the Prophet who gives the halal, who commands them to right and forbids them to wrong, etc., etc., and relieves them of their burdens and the shackles, the iron collars that were on them. This is one of the main tasks of a reformer, as being a liberator. We need to free our eyes, tongues, ears, minds from destruction, both in thoughts and actions. The people were captive at the time of our Prophet, and he liberated them. In the contemporary age, we also find chains, but of different kinds. We live in great confusion and bewilderment quite often. Are we really free to think, decide, choose, vote? Given the extent of the overwhelming nature of the external influences, together with the pressures of our own wants and desires, which are heavily expanded in the culture of materialism, we may have more or less lost the essence of true liberation from within. Spiritual and philosophical freedom forms the basis of each of the other freedoms, as human beings have been endowed with free will by God. Without contemplating and thinking on a matter freely, how can a person be free to form a particular train of thought or express an opinion? While society, the contemporary society, lays a lot of emphasis on the physical aspects of freedom, the tangible and worldly freedoms, the spiritual aspect is almost completely ignored. We are in a culture of instant gratification and lack of self-control, for example, where freedom of pleasure is ranked very highly. Many a times we also have a tendency to be influenced by ideas that are prevalent in society without proper scrutiny or consideration as to whether such ideas are appropriate or correct. These tendencies occur because of a lack of spiritual freedom. We are bound by our internal shackles. This imprisonment occurs when the provision of reason and intellect are forgotten. Such people are not free in the truest sense. Once the internal forces are defeated, we have to contend with the physical restrictions of freedom. A person cannot enjoy peace of mind unless he rids himself of both the internal and external shackles that captivate him, allowing him to become godly and resemble God in his qualities and actions. And it is here that the true meaning of servanthood, ubudiyya, works as a liberating force which can actually free us. We are also looking at the interplay of the term ubudiyya, ibadah, and freedom. What do we mean by ubudiyya? Is it a form of restriction? Because when, at the face value, when you look at it, enslavement, servanthood, servitude, these seem in contrast, in opposition to freedom. Are religious values a type of restrictions? We would say no. On the contrary, by becoming a servant of God, an individual becomes liberated and becomes a liberated force. Ubudiyya can be summed up in three things. Firstly, it is that the servant does not consider himself to own any of what has been bestowed upon him by God. He sees all property as God's and at his disposal. Secondly, a servant gives up his discretion to that of his masters and does not plan for himself and does not weigh what is good and bad for himself, knowing that the reins of his life are ultimately in the hands of his master. Of course, we make plans and go about life, but you understand what I mean. And thirdly, a servant is preoccupied with God's prescriptions and proscriptions, which work as the compass of his life. Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq salawatullahi alayhi in Misbah al-Sharia, in the section of Tashahhud, beautifully encapsulates this. He says, He created you a slave and commanded you to worship Him with your heart and tongue and your limbs. Realize your enslavement to Him by His lordship over you. Know that the forelocks of creation are all in His hand. Creatures possess neither breath nor sight except by His power and will. They are incapable of bringing forth the least thing in His kingdom unless it is by His permission and will. Allah said, وَرَبُّكَ يَخْلُقُ مَا يَشَاءُ وَيَخْتَارُ مَا كَانَ لَهُمُ الْخِيَرَةُ سُبْحَانَ اللَّهِ وَتَعَالَى عَمَّا يُشْرِكُونَ. Your Lord creates and chooses whom He pleases. To choose is not theirs. Glory be to Allah, the exalted above what they associate. Imagine for a second the relief if we can just hand over control to God. It's in a way that you can breathe out, giving over the power and control to Allah. When a servant has relegated his affairs to his master, the problems of the world become much easier for him. And the person's response to challenges and interaction with other creatures in this world becomes easier. He does not go after the world. He knows that the world is a means for him only and not an end. And he gives up fear and goes on to try to do what is right and leaves the rest to God. To be fearful and timid to do what is righteous because we are in danger of tarnishing our reputation or financial loss or relations would be a cause of forever trying to please something that is not being able to be pleased, and in fact sets us in a place of imprisonment. People are never really satisfied with the things they possess. Don't you see this? When are we really, ever really, truly satisfied? Constantly wanting more and more. More is always less. However, God demands what is wholesome and what is possible and rational and not for His benefit. Yes, of course, keeping in mind, pleasing people can also be a means of pleasing God with the correct understanding and the correct undertaking. Of course, I want you to take things in context. Yes? What can be better than to be serving your parents, for example, pleasing them, or your fellow brother or sister, coming to their assistance, or your children, or whatever, or a creature of God. Pleasing God by itself pleases oneself and provides one with a sense of fulfillment. Servanthood to God is actually a protection and a strong shield of human freedom. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. Continuing a little bit on this topic, the lexicographers have defined worship or ibadah as the pinnacle, the utmost point of humility. Since worship is the highest level of humility, and in fact, sajda is the mark of that, the most respectable or prominent part of the human being is put on the lowest part, which is the ground, in honor towards the highest entity. It does not benefit other than one who holds the highest levels of existence, perfection, grace, and generosity. Because of this, worship of other than God or ibadah is false worship, which is not befitting the human being. It does not befit me to bow my head towards anything or anybody else other than God. How beautifully we find this stated by Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salam in the Risalatul Hukuk, the treatise of rights, where he enumerates rights. And he states the greatest of God's rights against you is the right which he has made incumbent upon you for himself, and which is the root of all rights. Then he continues to explain, Haqqullahu Akbar, the greatest right is that of Allah. فَأَمَّا حَقُّ اللَّهِ أَكْبَرُ فَإِنَّكَ تَعْبُدُوهُ لَا تُشْرِكُ بِهِ شَيْئًا فَإِذَا فَعَلْتَ ذَلِكَ بِإِخْلَاصٍ جعل لك على نفسه أن يكفيك أمر الدنيا والآخرة. The greatest right of God against you is that you worship Him without associating anything with Him. When you do that with sincerity, He has made it binding upon Himself to give you sufficiency in the affair of this world and the next. Allahu Akbar. Look at the freedom that a person gets. Sufficiency in the affairs of this world and in the hereafter. By bowing to you, you are making me the most wealthy person, O Allah. And as you know, how famously Imam Ali alayhi salam said when he likened worship of three kinds or three levels. The worship of those who worshipped Allah out of desire for a group of people worshipped Allah out of desire for reward. Surely this is the worship of the traders. Another one out of fear. This is the worship of slaves. Still another group worshipped Allah out of gratefulness. فَإِنَّ قَوْمًا عَبَدُوا اللَّهَ شُكْرًا فَتِلْكَ عِبَادَةُ الْأَحْرَارِ. This is the worship of free men. Again, look at the interplay of the word ibadah and ihrar or ahrar. Yes? It is as if worship is actually leading to nothing but freedom. Imam Ja'far ibn Muhammad as-Sadiq alayhi salam beautifully describes servanthood, and he states, لِعِبَادَةُ جَوْهَرَةٌ كُنْهُهَا الرُّبُوبِيَّةِ. Servanthood is a substance, the kernel or the core of which is lordship. As a Sufi master beautifully said, your price is as high as you demand. What price am I going to demand for myself? If you demand God, your price is infinite. And if you demand the world, your price is as low as what you have desired. The heart is God's abode. Do not let anybody else in. Only God must be residing and presiding in your heart. The human soul knows no boundaries or limit. Thus, only God, who is limitless, is truly befitting for the human heart and his soul. Again, we see this beautifully in the words of the Master Imam Ali, when asked, how did you attain such a high station? Look what he said. I sat at the gate of my heart and let no one in except God. Allahu Akbar. It is like he did not want to violate that sanctified place with anything else other than what was befitting for it. Just in the same way that our most precious entity is to be reserved just for God, we see God also responding in a similar way. We find in the Hadith al-Qudsi, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Abdi khalaqtul ashya'a li ajlik." My servant, I created things for you. Wa khalaqtuka li ajli. And I created you for my sake. By means of worship and servanthood, the soul becomes like a polished mirror in which the divine light is reflected. And the more it is polished, the more it will reflect the flashes of divine illumination. And God becomes both the means and the end for the servant towards whom the servant moves. And how amazingly and befittingly it is stated in the Quran. In Surah number 17, Surah Isra, verse number 1. Subhanalladhi asra bi'abdihi laylam min al-masjidil haram ila al-masjidil aqsa. Glory to him who made his servant bi'abdihi travel by night from the sacred place of worship to the furthest place of worship. This indicates that the fact that traveling the path to godliness can only be achieved by means of ubudiyyah and by servitude. And we began by talking about that human beings are a locomotive being. We are on a journey. One must forego the pride and haughtiness that comes with presumptions of independence in this sense. And the root of this, which is the ego. In the tashahhud, first we give witness to what? To the Prophet's ubudiyyah and servanthood. Ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. Then to his risala and prophethood. This is because servanthood is the ladder by means of which he ascended to the station of prophethood. Servanthood or being God's slave is the key to sanctity. The title Abd is the best of titles, and on the night of ascension, the Prophet asked God to grant him ubudiyyah. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. Of course, you know this verse, and I created not jinn or humankind, but that they worship me. إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. Again, ibadah. We are all familiar with this verse. It can be looked in the context of that it is not befitting for the human being to worship any other than God, for that would be enslavement, restrictive, not worthy of the human being, in line with the verse, وَلَقَدْ قَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. Indeed, we have honored the children of Adam. O child of Adam, it is not befitting for you to worship anything but God. And we, in our own time, need to look at ourselves. What is actually enslaving me? We may not have physical shackles on ourselves, but what is it that is holding me back? And true freedom comes by worship of God, who frees you from all these shackles. And it is for that reason that a person who has submitted to God i.e. a Muslim has been granted the highest of freedoms, which is slavery or servanthood to God. Similarly, this verse sets out very clearly that it is only God that is worthy of worship. ذَلِكُمُ اللَّهُ رَبُّكُمْ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا هُوَ خَالِقُ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ فَاعْبُدُوهُ وَهُوَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ وَكِيلٌ. That is Allah, your Lord. There is no God but He, the creator of all things. Then worship Him, and He has power to dispose of all affairs. The commander of the faithful, Amirul Mu'mineen, salawatullahi alayhi, is quoted as saying, وَلَا تَكُنْ عَبْدًا غَيْرَكَ وَقَدْ جَعَلَكَ اللَّهُ حُرًّا. Do not be a slave to others, since Allah has created you free. We call Imam Hussein Abul Ahrar, subhanallah, the father of the free, do we not? It is a title he holds in part because of the freedom that he inspired his companions with, but also for his complete immersion in God and his servitude to God. Were there freer people than the divine prophets? Was there anyone more liberated than the blessed Prophet and Imam Ali alayhi salam? And ask yourself, to what degree was their servitude or their slavehood to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Finally, I want to end with this most touching and beautiful prayer, sometimes recited in prostration again by the master Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. Ilahi, kafa bi izzan an akuna laka abda. Oh my God, it is enough honor for me to be your humble servant. وَكَفَى بِي فَخْرًا أَن تَكُونَ لِي رَبًّا. And it is enough pride for me that you are my God. أَنْتَ كَمَا أُحِبُّ فَاجْعَلْنِي كَمَا تُحِبُّ. You are as I love, so make me as you love. We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He may inspire our hearts and remove all the obstacles and shackles that are from within us and from outside of us, and that He may enlighten our hearts with His love and His light and His nearness. Can we pray Surah Fatiha for all the souls that we have lost, and all those people who are in difficulty, and all those people who are unwell. Al-Fatiha. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin.